Hello there, and welcome to a short video covering kingdoms and the organization levels below that, as well as some of the characteristics of all life. So when we talk about groups of living organisms, we typically put them in kingdoms. There's an exception to that, the viruses. And we know, without me telling you, certainly, that there's a huge diversity that's in that system that's there. Now, in the groups that we have that are there, there's the archaea, which are very similar to the bacteria. They're both very small prokaryotic cells. There are some eukaryotic groups. There's the protists, the animals, the plants, and the fungi. Those are all organized in kingdoms. And then below that, we have some subcategories. You don't need to memorize the subcategories, but do certainly know these six kingdoms for sure, that you can name those and maybe give an example or at least sort of generally describe what's there. So when we talk about what falls into living versus non-living, we need to look at several factors. So there's some things, as I mentioned, you're going to think, well, that kind of applies to a mountain, or that applies to, my computer, things like that, things like the terms complexity. But then we get into movement, and then also response to stimulus. Now, again, we can look at some of these individually and say, hey, my computer, meets some of those, or my smartphone does things like that. So we need to list some specific properties that are unique to living organisms. So the first is the cellular organization that's here, so that living things have at least one cell. And so this already is going to exclude this other group that we often think of as living, but most scientists don't consider this group living, excludes the viruses because they don't have a cell. So we'll get into that a little bit later on. The metabolism is important, so that idea that there's energy that's processed and it powers other processes. Now, again, if we look at this individually, we could say, well, my car does that, right? So we need to look at this group of categories together: the cellular organization, the metabolism, and then another category, which is homeostasis, and that is to maintain the internal environment in a very stable way. And so we do this through things like temperature regulation. We regulate our own temperature. And again, we can look at some mechanical things, certainly, that do this as well. We regulate anything in animals. We could talk about heart rate, sleep, lots of internal regulation processes there. So there are two other categories. There is growth and reproduction, and then heredity. And so going back to growth and reproduction, this is the ability to either make more of, so for example, bacteria can make more of themselves, and then also to increase in size. So it could be and or. You actually can get larger. So humans, we can talk about getting, bigger as part of our growth. However, bacteria cells, when we talk about growth, we're talking about more and more bacteria being made, so a growth in population. So that's kind of a different way to look at items there. And then in heredity, we want to talk about that ability to pass genetic information. And so the two forms of genetic information are DNA. That's actually our main form that's passed down. But later on in another chapter, we'll talk about a close relative, RNA, which functions in this process. Functions to help. So RNA functions to help. And so all things work in a hierarchy. So we can talk about kind of the populational, which is the highest level, all the way down to the smallest level, which is cellular. And we can talk about even getting down into the non-living area here. So the molecules and the atoms, these are all non-living. and macromolecules as well, which we're going to get into in the next 2 chapters. And so chapter 2 actually goes through a lot of this atomic and molecule type structure, and then chapter 3 is going to get into the macromolecules, and then later on in chapter 4 we'll get into the cellular level that's there as well. So now as we move down, we're getting into the living. But the reason why we include, because we just talked about what's living, what's non-living, these sort of sub-levels, this atomic, molecule, and macromolecule, are absolutely key building blocks for the living components, which come a little bit later. Again, just looking at the levels of organization, so we're moving up. We stopped at the cell level. Remember, cells are a key part of defining life, so don't forget how important that is. Then we can move up to tissue. Cells are organized into tissues. The tissues are organized into organs and then organ systems. So I think you could think about nerve tissue, brain, nervous system, and then all of those systems make up an organism. And then we get into kind of the ecological level here. And again, we're still talking about living organisms. This is kind of ecological and also population as well. So we can have, as I mentioned, the populations. Populations are organized into a species. So we can say a population of mountain lions in New Mexico, compare that to a population of mountain lions in, say, Montana. But then we can talk about the entire grouping of mountain lion species, which we often do by country to talk about if it's endangered in that particular country. Or we could talk about worldwide species counts as well. And then those species are organized into a community, and a community is a mix of species. So now we're talking about the mountain lion and the bear and the trees that are there, and you know, the prey animals that are there. And then all of that is ultimately organized into an ecosystem. So for us in New Mexico, if you're in New Mexico, that might be the desert ecosystem. So within that, we had a community of animals and then species as well. Okay, that's what I have for this first part of chapter 1 to kind of summarize those different hierarchy levels there. Make sure you go back and review that and kind of look at some of those. First of all, starting with the first part I talked about here when we talk about kingdom and organizing the different groups of species. Then we talked about some of the properties that make up all life. So again, in order for you to be considered alive, you would have properties 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then we talked about how life is organized. So really all this was just talking about defining and organizing living organisms. And we talked about these non-living levels with the atomic, molecule, and macromolecule. Then we moved on to living, the cellular level, which contains organelles. That's part of that living cell. Then we went on from tissue, organ systems to organisms. And then finally moving up from population to species, to a community, which again is a mix of species, and then an ecosystem, which it would be your mix of communities. I thank you very much, and I hope that you find this video helpful.